The word relative has several different definitions, some of which apply to family members, some apply to music, some to math, so instead, I'm just looking at the definition of relativism. And this is from Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary 10th edition. Relativism, 1a, a theory that knowledge is relative to the limited nature of the mind and the conditions of knowing. 1b, a view that ethical truths depend on the individuals and groups holding them. Definition 2 has to do with relativity and being a relativist. Hey viewers, my name's Cara, and today I want to talk about a book that I read recently. It's a book that my grandmother was given by her Catholic church when I took her there for Easter Vigil. I thought it might be interesting to read, so I gave it a go. And it is part of a larger series of Catholic books called the Dynamic Catholic series. And they're written by several different people, so you might find another book that's in the series that wasn't written by this author, although this author has written multiple of them for the series. But this book in particular, the one that they gave us, is entitled The Four Signs of a Dynamic Catholic, and it is by Matthew Kelly. The subtitle, I should have said, is How Engaging 1% of Catholics Could Change the World. Naturally, I have to know what these four signs are. As I started to read this book, it opens up with an introduction to the four signs method, and then it breaks it down chapter by chapter into each of the four signs, and then there's an epilogue bringing it all back together. And at the end of all of the chapters, there's a little chapter summary. Oh, here we go. It came with a bookmark with Pope Francis on it as well. There's a chapter summary in gray outlining the main points that you should have taken from each chapter. And from the beginning, I kind of realized that you don't really have to be Catholic to apply these things to your faith. And that's the first thing I noticed, is that the author makes a lot of points that if you are knowingly applying them to a different religion are some really good points. There's some really good advice in here. The four signs are, since I'm sure you're dying to know, prayer, study, generosity, and evangelism. Prayer absolutely fits my path. Study, absolutely, absolutely. Generosity, it may depend on your definition, how you think of it, but generosity, I think, goes into a lot of people's religious paths, if not all of them. And evangelization is the one where people really stop and say, whoa, I don't want to be associated with that kind of thing, because of the negative outlook that some evangelists have brought to that term. It, again, is something that applies to a lot of different religious faiths. So I was reading this book with that in mind. So for example, the chapter on prayer, the author talks about things like developing a daily habit of prayer, setting aside a certain time of the day. Maybe it's the first thing when you wake up as you sit down and have your coffee, that's your time to chat with the deity that you believe in, God in this case. Or even for someone who doesn't have a religious belief, that could just be a time that you sit and talk maybe with yourself, or have a dialogue with some sort of concept, or just voice aloud, or maybe just in your head, your goals to yourself for the day. Study. This author talks about reading good Catholic books, reading so many good Catholic books a year, as well as reading the Bible, and constantly studying and learning more about Catholicism. Applying that to my own path, applying that to your path, anybody's path. I am always telling my viewers and other people who talk to me and myself to always just keep reading and keep learning different things and talking to people and learning more about their beliefs. You never know all of it, and there's always more to learn, whether it's more about yourself, more about other people, more about the world in general. Whatever it is, there's always more. The generosity chapter, he talks a lot about finances, money specifically, but he also talks about how it doesn't have to be money. Some people associate it with money because the church is always asking for donations and asking for money. But it could also be other types of generosity, such as, he says, after I read this book, giving it to another good Catholic and having them read it. Sharing good Catholic CDs and music and things of that nature. Or it could just be volunteering somewhere and helping people out. So like I said, all of these things I feel can kind of be applied to any faith. And then in the evangelization chapter, he talks about how everyone evangelizes, it just depends on what we're evangelizing about. The example that he uses in the book is someone evangelizing about their iPhone. When you get a new gadget that you really like and you tell your friend, oh man, it's so great, here's all the things it can do, here's what I really like about it, here's what I don't like about it, here's why you should try it out too. And I thought that was a great example. I know, for example, I know that I evangelize, but I feel that I don't do it in the regard of, I think this is the best for me, and therefore I think it's the best for everybody and you must follow this way. I recognize that I do definitely evangelize. I talk to you guys about my path and my views all the time, and of course I think that my views are the best for me, but there are a number of instances where I don't necessarily think that my view is the best one for everyone in the world to hold, because everyone is different. It just depends on what we're talking about. Obviously, if you're coming at this with the point of view that, I may not be a member of this religion, but I can get some good things out of it, sure, awesome. However, there are a couple things that I did not appreciate about this book, besides the fact that, of course, it's a Catholic book, and the whole book is about engaging Catholics, because he does have a really good point that the Catholic Church is very large, and so his argument is that if only 7% of all the Catholics in the world are engaged and doing these things, because he says, it's about 7% of each congregation that are actually very active participants in their church and do all of these different things, think about how adding on 1% of all the Catholics per year until every Catholic is as engaged, think of all the good things that could happen. That is true. And I think you could say the same about any religion whose people, whose followers or practitioners want to do good in the world. If some people in the group do it and others don't, of course it would always be better if more people were engaged and more people were doing these great things. So that is a great point. But so of course, this being a book about that, he always goes back to talking about the genius of Catholicism is the phrase that he uses. And the idea that to this author, being a Catholic is the best thing you can be, which of course now a lot of Christians don't consider Catholicism Christian, and in fact I guess the Pope had said that it is no longer considered Christian, but when I was being raised Catholic, it was just another branch of Christianity, so that's how I still think of it. So, aside from the non-Christians not agreeing with Catholicism, other Christians don't agree with it anymore either. So anyone other than a Catholic reading this book is going to be like, a little bit. But other than that, general Catholicism is the best way to go. Catholics do these things the best. There are just a few things in the book that bothered me, and one of them is this idea that Catholics do it the best. I didn't pull out any quotes ahead of time. I didn't want to go back through and mark specific things that I wanted to read to you. I think I'll be able to find one for a later point, but there are several times where the author will say something like, this is a really great thing that Catholics do, and if you look at the rest of the world, non-Catholics don't do this, or non-Catholics may do this, but Catholics do it the best. Catholics are the best at it, or Catholics are the only ones to do it. That kind of thing comes up a lot, which is untrue and a little bit unfair, but of course you gotta look at the bias of the book. Of course he's going to be biased towards Catholics, that's what the book is for. So we have to understand that books like this have an obvious bias. But that is something that bothered me a little bit over and over, because I would read things and I would say, no, I know people who live like that. I know people who do that, and they're not Catholic. They're this or they're that or they're the other thing. So this idea that there can ever be one religious group that is the best, or they have the best people, or they do the best things, I think is a fallacy, because people are just sort of unwilling to admit that people with whom they disagree can do things as good as they do, or for as much good as they are doing them. Obviously, another thing that was a little bit bothersome is just the idea of evangelization, and that people have a responsibility to convert other people, which, as we know, comes from specific religions believing that they are the best way, and that if people believe another way, something bad is going to happen to them. Something is lesser about their lives is the thought process for a lot of people. So again, it's a bias that we have to understand. But I think the biggest thing that really bothered me was when he talks about relativism, and I am going to try and find the page here. Oh, and throughout the book he uses the phrase, the best version of yourself, and that the ultimate goal is always to become the best version of yourself, which I think we can all agree with. It's just that our best versions of ourselves look different than what other people think our best versions of ourselves should look like. Okay, here, so it's on page 82 in chapter 3 about study, and it's under the subtitle, A World Without Truth. I'm quoting now about meaning and joy being impossible without meaning. Pope Benedict XVI said this about it. Relativism, which considers all opinions true, even if they are contradictory, is the greatest problem of our time. The author, Matthew Kelly, says, think about that for a moment. Consider all the problems in the world today, and yet he says relativism is the greatest of all of them. So what is relativism? It is the theory that there are no absolute truths, but rather all truth is relative. That is, something that is true for you may not necessarily be true for me. And so a lot of us that make YouTube videos about our paths, you hear us say this a lot. And it's the idea that no matter which way we find God, wherever we find our meaning, whatever specific way we want to practice, whatever cultural system we follow, it doesn't really matter in the long run whether you do it this way and I do it this way. It's really okay. I don't have to do it the same way you do. You don't have to do it the same way I do. So this is the idea that we're getting at. The author continues, this leads to an environment in which every person can do whatever he or she wants to do. This philosophy is full of contradictions because the idea that nothing is absolute is itself an absolute statement. Relativism is usually confined to the area of morals and ethics. In other areas, relativists will concede that everything scientifically verifiable is true, but that anything that cannot be scientifically verified is not. The problem is, you cannot scientifically verify this statement. Relativism holds that it is true for anybody, that nothing is true for everybody. This, of course, is a self-contradictory proposition. He goes on to talk about how relativists are supposedly tolerant of everything. You know, you do it that way, you do it that way, I do it this way, I am tolerant of it all. But he says there are some things that you should be intolerant to, such as abuse, child neglect, murder, things like that. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. And so the statements that he goes on to make quickly made it clear to me that this author's view of relativism is much different than our view of relativism when we say, essentially, as long as you're not hurting anyone, it doesn't really matter which way we do it. Because he goes on to give examples of, you know, if it doesn't matter what you do because that's true for you, then someone could believe that murder is okay, and a relativist would say, you know, that's your journey, that's true for you. So this author doesn't really allow for the reality of the fact that people who think of spirituality and religion in a relativist sense, your religion is right for you, my religion is right for me, he doesn't really allow that those people could also think that certain things are inherently morally or ethically wrong. He says that relativism applies to morals and ethics, so whatever I find morally wrong, you might find it morally right, and I'm okay with that, which is not true for me. When I talk about something being right for someone and that being okay with me, I'm talking about things that don't harm anyone. I'm talking about the way that you choose to pray, the God that you choose to pray to. Whether you want to follow a Norse path or a Celtic path or an Egyptian path or the Christian path or whatever, each individual person's path is different for them. That's what I'm talking about. I am not talking about, as he goes on to say, relativists will say that you cannot impose your morality on others, that you cannot legislate your personal beliefs. Which I agree with right there, such as I don't believe that a certain religion should be able to impose a national law which befits their personal faith, but then would control what other people do even if those other people don't share the same religious belief. But then he goes on to explain what he means by this, which is, but if you saw someone beating a child, wouldn't you try to stop that person? By doing so, you would be imposing your morality upon him or her, but it would still be the right thing to do. Some things are right and some things are wrong, but relativists will not concede this. So yes, that was the most annoying thing that I read in this book, because I do talk about relativism a lot when it comes to religion and spirituality, and I don't think I've ever really heard someone talk about it in terms of morality, such as beating children. Like, well, I think beating kids is wrong, but your religion teaches that beating kids is okay, and I'm okay with that. No, I've never said that. You've heard me probably in the past mention in some videos how there are times where I struggle with things like that, because some people's religious beliefs do include things that I find inherently morally wrong for anyone. And so that person might say, well, it's my religious belief that I do this, and that should supersede the fact that it's morally wrong in general. But I think there's a difference between what is right and wrong for different religions versus what is right and wrong as human beings. If you take religion out of the equation, what is just right and wrong as people? So I do consider myself a relativist when it comes to religion and spirituality, in the sense that, let's say you have 5 different people and we're all doing a prayer to bring peace into our lives. This person wants to pray to the Christian God about it, and they do it by sitting in a certain place and saying certain words and talking to that God. Someone else over here might want to talk to a god from a completely different pantheon, and they might do it with ritual tools and symbols or music or something like that, and I may choose to speak to an entirely different deity or concept, and I might do it in a different way, such as writing down my intent and burning it or something like that, and making it into more of a magic working. Someone else may not have any concept of deity whatsoever. They may be an atheist or a non-theist in that respect, and they may decide to pray, although they may not use that word, for peace in a different way. They might just say it out loud to themselves, say it in their head, make a subconscious wish for peace, or will peace to come into their lives. Someone else, I don't know, I'm trying to come up with an example that I would really would not do that. I don't know, maybe someone wants to wish for peace by fighting a war. They want to ask for peace in their lives by getting their anger out, like punching a punching bag or something. I personally probably wouldn't do that, because I just don't think that makes sense for me. But if it makes sense for that person, that's fine. However you want to do that, it's fine. We're not hurting anyone. Be careful about that punching bag, you may hurt someone. But if we're not hurting anyone, it doesn't matter to me which way you go about it. And actually, a little bit later in this book, the author talks about that, and he says, whatever way Catholics find God is fine. And he talks about how some people find God through reading the Bible, and the gospel just speaks to them and they find God. Other people may come to God because they read a good Catholic book or they listened to a good Catholic CD, and that's what won them over, and so that's how they get to God. Other people might be won over by the beauty of the Catholic churches, and they see the Catholic Church and they say, wow, that's just so beautiful. I want to follow that religion now, I guess. I don't know anyone that would choose based on building. I really like the architecture as well. But it doesn't have anything to do with the belief for me. But of course, that's what it was about back in the day when the churches were built. It was about bringing people's eyes upward toward God. Or he says that people might, have a friend who is really of the faith, very strong in their faith, and that friend's conviction makes you want to do it as well. And he says, whatever way people find God is fine. The only difference is he's talking about the same God all the time, but he does say any way they do it is fine, which, Matthew Kelly, that's relativism. So I think that the definition given in the book of how it only applies to morals and ethics, and I think that's what the definition that I gave at the beginning of the video says. Let me read it again briefly. A theory that knowledge is relative to the limited nature of the mind and the conditions of knowing, or a view that ethical truths depend on the individuals and groups holding them. So this definition does say that they are ethical truths. But I feel like when we're talking about religion, those of us who speak in a relativist point of view, we're not talking about things like beating children or murdering people, or, for example, a lot of people like to say, I see this on Facebook a lot, things like, when someone will say, I respect your view as long as you're not hurting anyone, someone will say, well, my religion says that I must sacrifice a kitten twice every month. Are you okay with that? No. I don't think we ever said that was the case. As long as you're not hurting anyone, why does it really matter? Why do we have to follow the same exact God? Why do we have to do it the same exact way? That's why there are so many different denominations of people who do believe in the same God concept. And then there are just so many other religions that believe in other concepts. So that was the most negative thing about that book for me, and I do hope that some people find this video who maybe are Catholic, already read this book, and I hope that you think about that point, because there is a bias to this book, just like a lot of books have. And we have to be aware of that. This author is probably not going to concede anything in his writings that is against Catholicism, or that puts anything at an equal footing or above Catholicism, because the point of the book is to get you to be a more engaged Catholic. So by making relativists and people who think that people are allowed to believe different things, by making us look like, like maybe we would be okay with someone hitting a child, that's going to make you not want to be one of us, and that's how the argument works. So I encourage you all, whatever you are reading, to think about it, consider the biases, consider your own biases, because we have them too. And don't be afraid to read books that are about views that you don't hold, because you can always learn something from it, or you can figure out a way to apply it to your own life. For those of you who do not watch my channel regularly, my name is Cara, I am a practicing pagan, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye. Somewhere earlier in the video I mentioned that this book talks about how people always think the church is asking for money, but really generosity, he says, is more than just money. I forgot to mention that this book also came with an offering envelope. I also completely forgot that several weeks ago after I finished reading this, I was talking to a friend of mine about a comment that is made in this book. The claim is made that the Catholic Church invented the scientific method. So I asked a friend of mine who is a pagan and a very science-based person, and I did my own research, and I found that yes, there were one or two people who contributed to it who were Catholic, but the vast majority of people who worked on the method or what became the method were not, and also the people who are credited with first using something like the scientific method were not Catholic. So I'm not quite sure where that claim came from, that the Catholic Church is responsible, but that was another thing that I was thinking about while reading this book.